The Gemara that we're learning is now we're going over Rabbi Yehuda's opinion about a Baal Keri. So we had a little break from the laws of a Baal Keri, a person who has a seminal emission, and now we're going to go back to those laws. We were talking about Shema, a person who has a seminal emission, if they're allowed to say Shema or learn Torah, or the Brochos of Shema, the benching, and so on, and the blessings before, after benching. The blessings before a meal, after a meal, the blessings before Shema and after Shema. And Rabbi Yehuda said that a person who is called a Baal Keri, he does recite the blessings before and after. So the Gemara is trying to figure out, what is Rabbi Yehuda's opinion? Does that mean he doesn't buy into this whole law of a Baal Keri being prohibited in studying Torah? Does he not buy into this? Is he not of the opinion that this is a decree? So let's start again at the two dots. Rabbi Yehuda, we're about halfway down the page, maybe about 25 lines from the top. Less than halfway, maybe, probably about, let's see, about 25 lines from the top of the page. Rabbi Yehuda says you make the bracha before and after. 21b. Lememra, does this mean to say the Kosav Rabbi Yehuda that Rabbi Yehuda holds Baal Keri is mutter b'divrei Torah? Does Rabbi Yehuda disagree with this whole premise that a Baal Keri is that we thought a Baal Keri is prohibited for become a takana of Ezra? And does he really not hold of us? And he holds a Baal Keri is mutter, he's permissible in studying Torah. Well, Rabbi Shua ben Levi, doesn't Rabbi Shua ben Levi say minayin? How do we know Baal Keri should also be the Torah that a Baal Keri is prohibited in studying Torah? And he brings a verse, Shenemar, as it says in a verse. And of course, the commentaries explain that this verse is, of course, an asmachta. It's not really an actual source, because if it was a source for this law, that would mean it would be a biblical law that a Baal Keri is prohibited in studying Torah, and that is not the understanding of the commentaries, that it's not a biblical law. It's a decree of Ezra, and that's pretty clear from other Gemaras as well, in addition to our Gemara later on, that it's a decree of Ezra, and therefore, even though the Gemara is now going to bring a proof from a verse, but it's only what we call a asmachta. It's something that Ezra relied upon when he made this decree. It's a hint in the verse, but it's not an actual law from the verse. It's a law from Ezra, who made the decree based, leaning on this verse. As it says in the verse, you should make it known to your children and your grandchildren. The samachle, and next to it, it says, the day that you stood before me in Choreb. And what does that mean? That just like at Har Sinai, no one was allowed to be a Baal Keri. So the same thing applied to studying Torah. When you teach your children and your grandchildren, you have the same laws that you can't be a Baal Keri. Ma'alahalon Baal Kri and Asuran, just like over there at Sinai, a Baal Keri was prohibited. Afkan Baal Kri and Asuran also here, a Baal Keri is prohibited. And what this means is that at Har Sinai, we needed to wait 3 days. Men and women were separated. Men were separated from their wives for 3 days. And this way, no one was considered a Baal Keri. Why? Because for a man, you didn't have to wait 3 days. You could simply go to the mikveh, and you're not a Baal Keri anymore. But for a woman, it is possible that the semen could drip out, and if it drips out and touches her body, it would make her tameh like a Baal Keri, and that the semen is considered alive up to 3 days, and therefore after 3 days it can't impregnate anyone. It's not alive anymore, so to speak. And therefore, up to 3 days. So for a man, he would go to the mikveh. And for a woman, you need to wait 3 days for the amount of time that it would take for the semen to not be like viable anymore. So that
action. Active, deactivate.
Deactivated? Okay. So so that's the reason about Keri. That's the reason why we see that at Sinai about Keri was prohibited. So the same thing would be studying Torah, which is a verse right next to it. So this is called smuchen. This is called comparing a law that it says one place to a law that it says right next to it. And this is in Dvarim, chapter 4. And it mentions there these 2 points. One is about Har Sinai, and the other is about teaching Torah. So we learn one from the other. It's called Doiresh Smuchen. We are darshaning, we are deducing a law from one to the other. And we're darshaning Smuchen. We're learning something that's close to the other law. We're learning one from the other, and we're saying that a Balkari is prohibited to study Torah. So the Gemara continues and says, what could Rabbi Yehuda think about this? I mean, how could Rabbi Yehuda argue? And so it says, and if you will say, Rabbi Yehuda loydarish smuchen, Rabbi Yehuda doesn't follow this code of this part of the code of how to understand the Torah. In other words, this is part of the code of understanding the Torah. The code language is that you darshan smuchim, but maybe Rabbi Yehuda doesn't have this as part of his way, his code of understanding Torah. He's not derish smuchim, but you can't say that because even if he doesn't follow this, in other words, he doesn't have in his tradition that you darshan smuchim, that you compare laws that are written next to each other. Even those opinions that don't do that, they all do it when it comes to Deuteronomy. So even if you don't do it in the rest of the Torah, but when it comes to Devarim, book of Devarim, the last book, the final book of the 5 books of Moses, when it comes to that book, that Sefer, everyone darshan smuchim. So you can't give the excuse that Rabbi Yehuda doesn't darshan smuchim because everyone darshan smuchim in Devarim. If you're going to say Rabbi Yehuda doesn't darshan smuchim, he doesn't compare laws that are written next to each other and learn one from the other. But Rabbi Yosef says, even someone who does not darshan smuchim, and the whole Torah, the Mishnah Torah darish. He does darshan smuchim in Mishnah Torah. And these psukim that we just brought were from Deuteronomy chapter 4. That means that it is in Devarim, the book of Devarim. And therefore, Rabbi Yehuda can't, how could he go against this teaching? It seems pretty established, pretty set that you learn the laws of Torah from the laws of Sinai. Now, why would a rabbi not darshan smuchim in the rest of the Torah, but in Devarim they would darshan smuchim? What would the reason be? Why would this code of how to interpret the Torah, why would it apply only in Devarim and not in the rest of the Torah? Anyone? Yes, Ezra. You're muted.
So in Devarim, you're doing a repetition, basically, of the Torah itself.
Rabbi?
So the question is, why would you want, I mean, Hashem already told us the first time around, why do you need to a second time? So therefore, you are then allowed to be doish from Devarim because it appears to be an extra. The other parts are not. So therefore, you're not given the freedom, so to speak, to do that in the other parts.
So because it's extra, that would be...
It's underscored, being underscored.
That it's trying to teach us more lessons. Right.
Right.
Okay, that's... I don't know if that's the exact wording that the commentaries use, but the common understanding here, very similar at least, if it's not the same, is that since since this is a repetition, so why did it not repeat everything the same in the same order as the previous in the Chumash? Why does it use different orders? Why does it put things different way? It must be telling us special laws why it's close to each other. So in other words, since this is a repetition, it should have followed exactly the way it was earlier. And because it changes things, the order of things, therefore, it's obviously telling us that I'm specifically doing it for a reason of teaching you some type of law. So there's a slight point there that's added to Ezra's statement, but it's along the same lines, and that is that Devarim is a repetition, and the fact that it doesn't have the same order of laws is to teach us one is learned from the other. I see Ruben wanted to say something. I'm not sure. Let's see on the chat. Perhaps because the rabbis wrote the manga and the Mishnah, and Moshe Rabbeinu wrote the Devarim. I'm not sure. Okay, I don't know. Maybe, I don't know. Yes, Ben? Ben? Ben?
Yeah. I wanted to say if it wasn't important, they wouldn't repeat it in Dvarim.
Well, obviously there's a reason, it's important. The question is, are we going to use this method of interpretation, just because it's repeated? Does that mean it's a reason to use this method? So yeah, obviously there's a reason why it's repeated, but the question is more about the smuchen. What's different about smuchen here? So this seems to be the understanding. It's brought in the Shita Mekubetzes, one of the commentaries, that's the difference. So the Gemara is saying that there's no excuse for Rabbi Yehuda not to learn this teaching because this is in Devarim, and everyone agrees that in Devarim you darshan smuchen. Now the Gemara tries to prove it. How do we know that in Devarim everyone darshan smuchen? So the Rabbi Yehuda loy darish smuchen b'chol haTorah kula, because we know Rabbi Yehuda does not darshan smuchen in the whole Torah, but he does. Let me see, Reb Shlomo Yosef, do you want to ask a question? Oh, guess not. Reb Shlomo Yosef, are you on? Okay. So how do we know that Rabbi Yehuda, the whole Torah, he doesn't darshan smuchim, and in Devarim, he darshans minolan? How do we know this? Delay darish. Minolan delay darish. How do we know that in the whole Torah he doesn't darshan smuchim? So the Gemara brings a brisa. Tanya, because we learned in a brisa. We learned in a brisa, Ben Azai Omer. Ben Azai says, Nemer machashefa loisachaya. It says that a magician, I don't know if there's a better translation, machashefa, person who does kishuf, it's a black magic,
Witch.
A witch, okay. A witch.
A sorcerer.
A sorcerer.
Sorcerer.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, we got good translations here. Thank you all. I should mention that it doesn't only apply to women, it applies to anyone. It happens to be more common for women. That's why it uses the female mechashefa, but it's not only specifically women. Even a man would be the same prohibition. Mechashefa leisachaya. It says you don't let a wizard, a witch, live. And that means that she's punishable by death. Although it doesn't tell us which death penalty it is. In the Torah, there are 4 death penalties. Skila, Sreifa, Hereg, Inchenek. Skila means stoning, which means they push the person off a cliff and off a high place, and then they throw, if the person doesn't die, they throw stones. They push them off a cliff tight, and the sreifa is burning, which means they pour lead down their throat. Hereg is chopping off their head, and chenek is death by choking. And so the Gemara is going to try to figure out which death penalty does this witch get. So it says in Machashefa Leisachaya, she gets the death penalty. She's not. We don't let her live, but doesn't say which penalty. But it also says V'nemar Kol Sheichev and Behema Mois Yumas. It says whoever has relations with an animal, a human has intimate relations with an animal, Mois Yumas, he gets the death penalty. And when it comes to the sin of having relations with an animal, there it does say what the death penalty is. There it says the death penalty is skila, being stoned. So it says samchu inyan loy. It puts the law next to it. The law of mechashefa is right next to the law of having intimate relations with an animal. Loimar, to tell you, just like a person who has relations with an animal gets the stoning, also mechashefa is punishable with stoning. Amar le Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says, just because it's close to it, we're going to give this person such a harsh punishment. According to the, there's a discussion, what is the most harshest of the punishments? And at least one opinion says skila is the most harshest of all the punishments. And the Gemara here is surprised, the Rabbi Yehuda here is surprised that we would give a person skila just because it's close. It says the law of a witch next to the law of the person who commits this act of adultery with an animal, act of sexual relations with an animal. Just because it says it next to it, you're going to give this person such a harsh punishment of skila? Yes, Ezra.
Why is skila considered to be the harshest? I mean, I would think that sreifa, where they force your mouth open and they pour hot lead down that would be even worse.
Well, this is there is such, I believe it's an argument between in the Mishnah, which one is worse, skila or sreifa. If I'm not mistaken, it's in Tractate Sanhedrin.
Yeah, it is.
And we could look it up. It is an argument. Do you see it there? You see it brought down?
I'm sure that it was discussed, but I mean, just from looking what is happening to you, I would assume that would be the worst case. I mean, your insides are basically burned out from the inside out, just so that the body doesn't appear to be destroyed. But even so, I mean, it's a horrible death.
Well, I'd have to look up the best place to look it up. I'd have to look up the details, the specific details of two things. Number one is of how the actual, all the details of both deaths. And the second thing is what the explanation of these two rabbis, of the opinions in the Mishnah, why they argue on it. So we could look it up.
Rabbi,
And,
I have a
maybe have it for
question.
tomorrow. Yes, Susan.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but one of the commandments is thou shalt not kill.
Mm.
No, please. Sorry.
That's an interesting question. How could the Hashem allow the death penalty if it's a prohibition of do not kill? Well, the answer is that we aren't allowed to kill, but court is allowed to kill, and sometimes it's a mitzvah for them to kill. Imagine if they save a nation from tragedy, imagine they save a community from being wiped out. So it's not that kill, even, I mean, look at what people die, right? Hashem kills them, so to speak. Hashem lets the angel of death take them. So obviously,
The thing is, if what you're saying is that
before you speak, Susan, before you speak, Susan.
It's men are deciding that first of all, you said that we don't believe in magic. So what, I do not understand this at all.
Right. So basically, first of all, there is a concept also of that a person is allowed to kill in self-defense. So even though the Torah says you're not allowed to kill, if someone's out there to kill you, you are allowed to kill, and you're a mitzvah to kill in self-defense. So, and also if you see someone trying to kill someone else, you're supposed to save that person.
Stop it, right.
Killing. So there are many cases where killing is not only allowed, but a mitzvah. So that I think knocks off your whole question. Now,
but the thing is, what you're
the other point
making a
is
judgment on a person that they are a sorcerer or a witch or a warlock. It's a group of people making
So Susan, so the thing is that the death penalty is only done when you have the court, that there is a discussion. They go through a whole process. It's not this is not just some rabbi decides. But someone makes a phone call and says, "Rabbi, we have a case here," and the rabbi goes and takes out his, brings the person to the second floor and pushes them off and throws some stones. You know what I mean? This is not a homemade remedy type of thing for the community. But the thing is that magic, witchcraft, is connected to idol worship, and so that's that gives a little understanding of the prohibition. Yes, Ben.
I want to say two things. Yes, I wanted to say two things. We are allowed to kill our enemies. So if somebody is an enemy to the people, we should be allowed to be killed. But as far as why stoning is the harshest one, I think it's because when it's the only place where they say, if they drop you and you didn't die, they keep stoning you. So it's not immediate. It's very painful and takes time.
Okay, thank you.
They don't say that, they continue pouring down stuff on you.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Ben. Yes, Mel.
I just wanted to point out that the Gemara says about the Sanhedrin, and I think it says something like 70 years or in a period of time that they were in session, that they said they may have put one person to death or none at all. In other words, this is taken so seriously. It's not something like you said, they take a guy and drop him off the Empire State Building. Our halachas are Hashem's Torah is so precise. and its thing. It's not a, you know, something that's like, oh, he did that, you know, throw him over the balcony, nothing like that. But we see that the Sanhedrin were so careful in their judgment against a human being, and life is so important to Jewish people that, you know, God forbid, we're not people like that. You know, it's like the
Right.
old, it's not that way.
Thank you. Yes, correct. There is a Mishnah that talks about how rare it was to ever do the death penalty. So thank you, Mel. That's correct. That's correct. And thank you, Ben, for having a thought of explaining, you know, a little about the difference between a possible difference in why stoning is worse. Thank you, Ben. Yes, Robert.
If I remember correctly in my readings, there has been essentially an issue with translating from "thou shalt not kill" to from "thou shalt not murder," because there are very distinct differences in taking someone's life. And I think in the more relevant, you know, non-Jewish texts, murdering and killing are not distinguished, because there's different motivations behind killing something because of not having a reason, and murder for, again, killing somebody. So I just remember that as part of my readings, the distinction and the definition of taking someone's life.
Thank you. I think, Susan, I think that's important. What Robert just
the only
said.
thing I just want to say is that when my father came back from the war, the fact that he had to kill people changed him drastically as a Jewish person. Drastic change.
Okay, so anyway, we can look into this maybe further. I don't know, Ezra, if you want to look it up in Sanhedrin. We'll have to take a look at. I just pulled up here. I think it's page 50 in Sanhedrin, so we could take a look over there and check out the commentaries. Okay, now we'll get back to the purpose of our bringing this subject was not really to understand all the details of it, but just to realize that Rabbi Yehuda is not comfortable by saying, well, because one law is next to the other law, so we're going to decide that the person deserves skila? Is that a good enough reason? So, which means that Rabbi Yehuda does not darshan smuchim. He doesn't learn a law, especially a serious law, from one case to another that are next to each other, to put next to each other. And the Gemara says, how does Rabbi Yehuda know what to do with a wizard? So the Gemara says, Ella, we're on the first medium size line. Ella oivi yadoini b'chlal kol hamachashru. Rather, there are two cases. There is two types of this type of magic that are they are different types of magic that are part of mechashefa, this whole idea of doing these type of idol worship type of stuff, which are bringing up from the dead and making, doing these type of things. So they're called oiv and yadoini. Oiv and yadoini, one of them is getting the dead to speak from the armpit. In other words, someone brings up the dead and has a voice come out of the armpit. The other one is yadoini, is putting a bone in a certain animal bone in one's mouth, and causes the dead to speak from it. So all these types of black magic that are done, and these two are two types of this type of prohibition. They're included in this category of prohibitions called oiv and yadoini. They're all included in the mechashefa category. So the Gemara says, "Ela oiv yadoini b'chlal kol hamachashvim." They were part of the category of machashev, of this being a witch. V'lama yatsu. And why did they go out? And the Torah specifies them in a separate place and gives them a separate, gives them a separate verse and tells them the law about them. But Even Yirgumu Eistam, it says clearly about these cases that they get skila, they get stoned. It doesn't say mechashefa what happens, but it does mention about these two specific cases within the category of mechashefa, and the Torah goes and specifies them that these do get skila. And there is a paragraph that we recite in the prayers every single day in the morning, and it's it mentions Rabbi Shmuel it mentions the 13 methods of how to interpret the Torah, and from those 13 methods, one of them is Kol davar shaya b'chlal v'yatza min haklal. There was something that was included in a general category, and then it goes out from the category. Loyla lamed al atzma yatza. It doesn't only teach a law about itself. Ela lamed al klal kula yatza. That it's teaching about the entire category is also excluded to teach that law. Meaning, you have a general law about witchcraft, and then you have the law of Oiv and Yadaini, which are two specific types of witchcraft. Now, when the two specific types of witchcraft are taken out of the general category to tell you that they get skila. So the verse comes and tells you, by the way, these two forms of witchcraft get skila. So there's a rule in the Torah that when it goes and tells you that it takes two of these individual specific cases from a general rule, it's coming to tell you a law about the entire general rule. It's not general cases. It's not specifically telling you only these cases. Otherwise, it would clarify it better. But since it takes them out from, initially they were part of that general category, and now it takes it out, it's telling you something about the general category, that the whole category gets skila. So that's how Rabbi Yehuda knows it, that mechashefa, a witch, gets skila, gets stoned. So again, we have two opinions. How do you know a witch gets skila, gets stoned? The first opinion is from smuchin, because it's written next to each other, and that Rabbi Yehuda doesn't go for that, because this is in the book of Shemais, in the book of Exodus, and Rabbi Yehuda does not darshan smuchim in the first 4 books of Moses, including the book of Exodus. However, Rabbi Yehuda will understand also that a witch does get the stoning punishment, and the reason why how does he know that? The reason is because when it says that Oiv and Yadaini, which are two types of witchcraft, it says that they get skila, but there's a rule in the Torah that when these laws are specified for the case of that they get the punishment of skila, it teaches us that the whole category gets skila. And therefore, Rabbi Yehuda also agrees that they get skila, but he learns it from a different source. The first opinion was from smuchin, it's written next to each other. The next, the Rabbi Yehuda's opinion, is because it's one of the laws of the Torah that when you have one case that's in a category, it's part of a category, and it gets excluded to teach us a law, that law applies to the whole category. So when it says skila, when it says stoning by Oiv and Yadaini, so that law applies also to a mechashefa, witchcraft. It's telling us a law that the entire witchcraft sins are included, get skila, get stoning. So that's the source. What do we see from this whole Gemara? That Rabbi Yehuda does not learn things from when they're written next to each other. He's not doiresh smuchin. So the Gemara continues, and it says, Uva Mishnah Torah, we're on the 3rd line, and in the 3rd medium-sized line. Uva Mishnah Torah Menolan de Darish. How do we know in Deuteronomy that Rabbi Yehuda does learn laws from things that are written next to each other? The Tanya, because we learned in a brisa, Rabbi Eliezer Oimer, Rabbi Eliezer says, Noise Adam Anusas Aviv. A person can marry a woman who his father was not married to. According to Jewish law, a man is not allowed to marry a woman that his father at some point was married to. If a person's father was married to a woman, and whatever happened, they got divorced, or the father passed away, the son is not allowed to marry that woman. Incest. What happens? The same thing applies to a daughter-in-law. A man is married to a woman, and they get divorced, and the father, the woman wants to marry the father. They're not allowed to. Incest. What happens if a man has relations with a woman, either through rape or through seduction, seduces her to have relations, but they don't get married? So is that called incest or not? Is that prohibited? So the general law in the Torah talks about marriage. If a man is married to a woman, that woman is considered a person's father's wife, the father's wife. The son can't marry her. But what about if you just had relations with someone out of wedlock? That would not be prohibited, because the Torah law says marriage when the Torah prohibits this. However, there is reason to possibly prohibit it in a case of a father. What does that mean? Let's read it inside. The Tanya, we learned in a brisa. Rabbi Eliezer says, Noise Adam, a man could marry Anusas Aviv, a woman who was raped by one's father. So if a person's father raped a woman, the son would be allowed to marry her. Umafutas Aviv, and a person who was seduced by one's father, the son would be allowed to marry her. Anusas benoi, if a person's son raped a woman, the father would be allowed to marry that girl. Umafutas benoi, or if the son seduced a girl, the father would be allowed to marry that girl because they never got married. Rabbi Yehuda oiser bi'anusas aviv umafutas aviv. Rabbi Yehuda prohibits any woman that had relations with one's father. Rabbi Yehuda says the son is not allowed to marry. How does Rabbi Yehuda know this? Where does Rabbi Yehuda get this law from? The Amar Rav Gidl, Amar Rav, my time at Rabbi Yehuda, Rav Gidl, Amar Rav says, Rav Gidl says the name of Rav. What's the reason of Rabbi Yehuda? Why? Why can't he marry a woman who his father had relations with? It doesn't say in the Torah, it doesn't clearly prohibit such a thing. Because it says in the verse, and this is a verse in Devarim, Lo yikach ish as eishes aviv. Person's not allowed to marry the wife of his father. V'lo yigale knaf aviv. And then it says an interesting term, that a man is not allowed to reveal the garment, the knaf, the fringes, the garment of the person's father.
Expose.
What do you say, Ezra?
Expose.
Expose. You can't expose, right? Reveal the knaf of it. So Rabbi Yehuda says, what does this mean? It means knaf shera of it. It means that it means to include not only marriage, but it means the knaf, the garment that the father that the father saw, the son is not allowed to marry. So in other words, it's adding a extra statement there to include even a woman who the father just simply had relations with. So the Gemara asks, how do we know that it's talking about, I understand that it's an extra word, knaf of it, with extra few words there. Person shouldn't expose the knaf of his father. But how did that mean someone who the father raped? I mean, how do we know that it includes someone who the father raped? The samach lei, because it's right next to the law of being of a person raping someone. That the punishment of someone who rapes. So it says this law right next to that. So we see that Rabbi Yehuda learns smuchin, things that are written next to each other, and in the book of Deuteronomy. So that basically teaches us that even though Rabbi Yehuda does not learn maybe, even though Rabbi Yehuda does not darshan smuchim, doesn't darshan the things that are close to each other in the 4 books of Moses, but in the book of Deuteronomy, he does learn things that are close to each other. So going back, now we come back to square one. What did we start our whole Gemara trying to say? Our whole Gemara was trying to say that the law of a Balkari reciting prayers is because in the book of Deuteronomy, it's right next to the law of teaching Torah. The Balkari law is right next to, about Sinai is right next to the law of teaching Torah. So this would make us would seem to be a pretty good proof, a good argument to say that a Balkari is not allowed to recite these prayers. Why is Rabbi Yehuda allowing a Balkari to recite prayers? The first opinion in the Mishnah said he can't recite any prayers. He can only think of them, and even thinking, maharher, only some of them. And Rabbi Yehuda goes and says, no, you can say all of them. What about the smuchin? What about the verses that are written next to each other in the book of Deuteronomy? And even Rabbi Yehuda agrees that you do learn things from the book of, when they're written next to each other in the book of Deuteronomy. So this is what the Gemara is bothered with. The Gemara's answer is, Omri, we say in, yes, true. The Mishnah Torah Darish. You're right, Rabbi Yehuda does darshan smuchim in the book of Deuteronomy, Devarim. V'hani smuchim miboyle leidach to Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. But these things that are written next to each other are needed. These verses, that are written next to each other are not used to learn that a Balkari is prohibited to recite words of Torah. They're really used for another teaching of Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. The Amar Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, because Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi says, Kol hamalamed levnoi Torah, whoever teaches his son Torah. Maila olav akosov, the Torah considers it ki'ilu kibla mehar chayrev. It is as if he received the Torah himself at Har Sinai. So you teach your son Torah, and even though the fathers, when Moshe was saying these teachings, he was telling the fathers who actually were there at Har Sinai, but the sons, he was telling the fathers, if you teach your sons Torah, it is as if your sons received it at Har Sinai. Ki'ilu kibla mehar chayrev shenemar, as it says, v'hidatam levanecha v'levnei vanecha, you should teach your sons and your grandsons the Torah. And right afterwards, Ksiv Basrei, right afterwards it says, Yoim asher amadata, the day that you stood, lefnei Hashem alekecha b'chayrev, the day that you, before Hashem at chayrev, when at Har Sinai. Which means that Rabbi Yehuda does darshan, does learn a law because of the smuchim, because the two verses are next to each other. But he doesn't learn your law that you want us to learn. He learns a different law. And what is the law that he learns? Not the law that a Balkari is prohibited from studying Torah and saying words of Torah. He learns a different law. The law is that when you teach your son Torah, it's such a special mitzvah. Teaching your son Torah, it's as if he received it at Har Sinai. It's as if he received the Torah at Sinai. Of course, all of our souls were there at Sinai, but here it's like physically, it's as if he was there physically at Sinai. So that's what the Gemara says that Rabbi Yehuda learns. So that's the assumption, the understanding of the Gemara, that maybe Rabbi Yehuda does not agree with this, with this teaching of that we initially said of Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, because he has a different teaching of about those two verses. So that's the assumption, at least at this point of the Gemara. Now, afterwards, the Gemara will jump to the assumption that
Rabbi
Yehuda does agree with the Balkari prohibition. So we're going to be going back. We're going to be going back to the other way of thinking as well.